Why falling asleep in Viking times was an act of courage. To sleep in Viking times was to surrender, to frost, to enemies, and to the unknown. The night in the north was not simple darkness. It was a presence, ancient and alive. When the sun vanished behind the mountains, it did not merely set, it fled. For months the world remained trapped beneath a black sky that refused to turn blue. The sea froze into mirrors. The forests stood silent under their own weight, and inside the wooden homes where people huddled for warmth, time itself seemed to stop breathing. To close one's eyes in such a place required courage, because sleep was not rest. It was a risk. Every Viking knew that the cold could kill quietly between dusk and dawn. The body's warmth drained away, as if stolen by unseen hands. Sometimes by morning, the fire was gone and one of them was still. Lips blue, eyes open to the rafters, breath turned to frost. They called it frost's mercy, a death without struggle, without sound. Families pressed close together beneath thick furs, the air heavy with smoke, damp wool, and the sour scent of fear. Beside them slept the animals, goats, dogs, sometimes even pigs, breathing in rhythm with the humans they shared the night with. Each body was a wall against death. It wasn't affection that bound them together, it was survival. Outside, the wolves moved silently through drifts of snow so deep they swallowed sound itself. The villagers imagined their yellow eyes watching the houses from the tree line. Any noise, a falling icicle, a shifting beam, could become the start of a story no one wanted to hear, because they believed that when the world was that quiet, the dead began to walk. They whispered that the draga, the restless corpses, rose in winter's longest nights to visit the living. A sudden movement in sleep, a moan from a dreaming man. These were signs that something had brushed against him. To protect themselves, people laid iron blades beside their beds. Iron, they said, frightened spirits. In the dark, every sleeper was both a body and a battlefield. Time was measured by flame. The Norse had no clocks, no glow beyond the hearth. When the fire thinned, the night deepened. When the embers died, the world ended. In midwinter, darkness stretched 16 hours or more. To lie awake in that silence was to hear the world shift, the pop of freezing beams, the whisper of snow crawling across the roof, the steady drip of melting ice from a breath too warm. Courage, in those months, was measured by heartbeat. They feared not only what prowled outside, but what rose inside their minds. Dreams were not imagination. They were messages. A dream of blood meant battle. A dream of a bear meant death. A dream of water meant distance. Someone you loved would leave and never return. So before sleeping, families whispered small prayers. Keep the fire alive. Guard my breath until morning. Mothers sang lullabies of warning, not comfort. Sleep soft, child, sleep still. The frost walks the fields tonight. When darkness lasted 16 hours, people didn't rest. They vanished into visions. Sleep broke into two halves, the first and second sleep. Around midnight, most would stir. They rose halfway, lit a coal, spoke softly, or sat in silence. Some prayed, some wept, some stared at the smoke hole as if it were an eye. In that space between waking and dreaming, strange things happened. Men said they saw shadows moving without owners. Women whispered words they didn't know. Farmers claimed to hear the gods breathing in the rafters. Science would later call it adaptation, the mind dividing the endless night into fragments of awareness. The Vikings didn't know that. They only knew that to sleep too deeply was dangerous. Those who sank too far might not return. So they trained themselves to hover, to listen even as they dreamed. Imagine that world. No hum of machines, no light except the pulse of fire. Outside, the sky burned with the aurora, streaks of green and red rippling like cloth across the void. They said those lights were armour of fallen warriors still fighting above the clouds. When the curtains of colour moved, children hid their faces, afraid the dead might follow the gaze down to earth. Even grown men turned away. When the sky glowed without fire, it meant the gods were watching. In that eternal twilight, sleep was sacred and perilous. Dreams were not private. They belonged to the gods and to fate. The word draumar meant more than dream. It meant omen. To ignore a dream was to insult the Norns who wove the threads of every life. Each morning began not with work, but with interpretation. Husbands and wives asked each other what visions had come. To forget a dream was to risk offending destiny itself. And always the fire waited. It had to be fed before sleep, turned, buried in ash, coaxed to live until dawn. They called the last member the heart. If it died, shame followed. A home without flame was a house abandoned by the gods. In some places, the last person awake whispered to the fire, as if to a living being, "Watch us while we rest." Perhaps they weren't wrong. In that blackness, the glow of one ember did look like an eye keeping vigil. The darkness outside was not empty either. Wolves came close. Bears sometimes sniffed the outer walls. The people believed shapeshifters prowled among them. Men who wore their fear until it turned them into beasts. To dream of a wolf was to risk becoming one. So charms carved from bone hung above sleeping heads, and small hammers of Thor rested beside the bed. Even the brave slept lightly. Every night I tested them. To lie down was to defy the elements. To close your eyes was to trust the fire, the gods, and each other. The sagas tell of warriors who taught themselves to sleep, standing, spears in hand, eyes half open, ears alert to the smallest noise. They were not restless by choice. They were restless by design. Too much fear led to madness. Too little led to death. The ones who survived learned balance. 3 breaths of calm, 1 of vigilance, again and again until dawn. There was no comfort, but there was peace in endurance. They accepted the dark as part of life, not as something to conquer, but to coexist with. The modern world can hardly imagine it. We chase away every shadow, leave no corner unlit, and call it safety. But they knew better. They respected the dark like a god. When dawn finally arrived, when frost loosened its grip and pale light seeped into the sky, they would open their eyes slowly, uncertain whether they had truly awakened or only crossed into another layer of the same dream. Someone would stir the coals. The first crackle of flame was like breath returning to the body of the world. Another night survived, another small victory against eternity. And as the smoke curled toward the roof and the light grew stronger, they listened to the quiet. Some said that if you truly paid attention, you could hear the night leaving, whispering as it went, soft and certain, promising that it would return. The wind itself could think on those nights. It pressed against the walls like a creature testing for weakness, sighing through the tiniest cracks until the sound became almost human. Sometimes it is called a name. Those who heard their own were warned never to answer. The moment you spoke back, the Draga would know where to find you. Scholars today find small bundles buried beneath Viking thresholds. Bones, herbs, bits of iron. Protection charms for the sleeping. The metal was for strength, the bone for memory, the herb for breath. To the Vikings, each object had its own spirit, and the right combination built a shield invisible to the eye. Mothers whispered over these charms before laying their children down, pressing a thumb between the brows and saying, "Stay where your soul belongs." Archaeologists once found a sleeping platform in Sweden blackened with soot and ash. Between the planks lay the tooth of a bear. Someone had hidden it there on purpose. The bear was the perfect sleeper, hibernating through death's shadow and returning alive. Whoever placed that tooth had been asking for the same gift, to wake. And yet even with such rituals, the nights took their toll. After weeks of darkness, people began to dream while awake. They saw flickers at the edges of vision, faces forming out of smoke, shapes bending the shadows. A sudden shiver, a breath that didn't belong. The line between dream and waking dissolved until every sound was suspect. There are old tales of warriors who lost their minds in winter. They weren't cursed or drunk. They were consumed by sleeplessness. One man in the Floamana saga spoke of lying awake for 7 nights, afraid to close his eyes because he swore the dead waited on the other side of sleep. When he finally surrendered, he dreamed of drowning under ice, and when the others found him in the morning, he was stiff and wet, though the floor was dry. Modern science calls it hallucination, born of exhaustion. The Vikings called it the veil opening. They coped the only way they could, through rhythm and repetition, the sound of grinding grain, the beat of a hand against the wall, the murmur of a prayer half remembered. Anything to keep the silence from settling too deeply into the skull. If they could keep the night busy, it might forget to take them. Some villages built their houses in circles so that light from one hearth touched another through cracks in the doors. When a flame flickered in the distance, it meant life. They believed the dark could count, that it numbered its prey, and that sharing firelight confused it. Every family had stories of a night when someone failed to wake. No screams, no struggle, just stillness. In those moments, grief and gratitude mixed together. The dead had gone quietly, and the living still had warmth to tend. The next evening they would sleep again in the same place, because there was nowhere else to go. Fear was a constant companion, but so was acceptance. And beneath it all, something older than fear, a strange peace. They had learned that to fight the night was useless, better to endure it, to live inside it. The darkness was not their enemy, it was their teacher. It taught them patience, taught them humility, taught them that even the smallest flame mattered. When the fire dimmed, someone always whispered the same line. Keep breathing, the gods can hear it. And in that whisper lay their entire philosophy, that life itself was an act of sound against silence, of warmth against cold, of hope against everything that wished to bury it. The strange Viking bond between rest, death, and dreams. They said the dead did not stay quiet in the north. When the ground froze too hard to dig, bodies waited above it, wrapped in linen, sealed in ice, breathing the same cold air as the living. And when people finally slept, they sometimes dreamed of those bodies moving. To the Vikings, the world of the dead was not far away. It was beneath their feet, behind the next hill, or hovering just beyond the edge of the firelight. The veil between the sleeping and the buried was thin. If a man lay too still, if his body cooled too much, if his breath came faintly enough, the gods might mistake him for one of the fallen and carry him off before morning. They built their homes close to graves not out of disrespect, but out of belonging. Ancestors were protected. A burial mound was a guardian, not a warning. When storms howled, the villagers whispered toward those mounds, hold the walls, keep the wind out. Yet that nearness also meant the dead were listening, and sometimes they answered. There are stories carved in runes of people who heard knocking in the snow after midnight. Some said it was branches cracking, others claimed it was bones. When dogs barked at nothing, they would cross themselves, or, before Christianity reached them, mutter a name. Odin, Freyja, Hel. Each could rule the night in their own way. Odin watched the slain. Freyja gathered souls of women and warriors alike. Hel ruled the rest. If one of them had taken notice of your home, your sleep would not be peaceful. In winter, bodies could not be buried at once. They were placed in barns or side rooms, bound in ropes to keep them from sitting upright, faces turned to the wall. When the thaw finally came, they were lowered into the ground. Sometimes a member of the family would dream of the exact moment that should happen, the soil softening, the spirit sighing, as if finally released. They took that as a sign from the dead themselves. The grave digger was simply following a command, whispered through sleep. Modern archaeologists have unearthed graves where the corpses were pinned down with stones, or laid face down as if the living feared they might rise again. In some, iron knives rested across the chest, a quiet war declared against whatever might crawl out of the body when darkness returned. These were not symbols of cruelty, they were acts of mercy. Better to chain the dead to the earth than let them wander back into their loved ones' dreams. Sleep was a rehearsal for that stillness. People watched each other's chests for movement. If someone seemed too quiet, A hand would reach out in the dark to touch the shoulder, to feel warmth. If the skin felt cold, panic spread like fire, because they knew that the distance between dream and death could vanish in a single hour. They called the dead who rose again Draga, the walkers. Some were warriors who refused to rest, still guarding treasure or vengeance. Others were ordinary people who died wrong, without burial, without peace, without farewell. To dream of one was a warning. The next night someone in your family would fall ill, so they guarded their sleep with small rituals. A bowl of ashes near the bed to trick spirits into counting the grains before they reached the sleeper. A comb placed under a pillow to remind the restless dead of the vanity they'd left behind. A door left half open so the soul could wander freely back if it wished. Better to visit than to haunt. Even among the converted, the fear lingered. Centuries later, Christian monks recorded tales of corpses walking in the north called Drauga, who press upon the living in their beds. The monks called it blasphemy, yet they wrote it down anyway. Perhaps even they were afraid. Sleep in those nights was not only vulnerability, it was communion. When a mother lost her child, she sometimes dreamed of feeding it again, holding it close by the hearth. When she woke, the air would still feel warm where the child had been. Men dreamed of brothers who had fallen in raids, sitting beside them sharpening blades that no longer existed. People woke crying but grateful, because the dream proved the soul still lingered somewhere near. In the sagas, there are stories of warriors who claim to have spoken to the dead in dreams. One tells of a man visited by his slain comrade, who warned him not to sleep near the shore that night. He moved inland, and a rockslide crushed the house where he had lain the night before. Another tells of a woman whose dead husband told her where to find a stolen heirloom. In the morning she dug where he had said, and found it. To them death was not silence, it was simply another room in the same house. Because of this, sleep was treated like a door. Each night when they lay down, they crossed the threshold between the living world and the other one. Before closing their eyes, they spoke to their ancestors aloud, naming them so they would not be mistaken for strangers when the dreams began. The young learned early to respect the boundaries. A careless sleeper could invite the wrong guest. And still the body craved rest. The mind drifted whether one believed or not. When exhaustion finally broke through fear, they surrendered. The dreams came, faces glowing pale as moonlight, voices calling from under frozen earth, hands reaching out not to harm, but to remind. In the morning, the living would tell one another what they had seen. Sometimes the dream made sense. Often it did not. But all believed that meaning waited, hidden like roots under snow. Archaeologists now find traces of that faith in the graves themselves. Some were built with benches carved inside, places for the living to sit and visit. In a few, evidence of food, bread, honey, mead, left to rot beside the dead. Offerings or perhaps meals shared in quiet conversation before burial. They believed the dead grew hungry. They also believed the living might someday need the same kindness. To sleep surrounded by such faith was both comfort and terror. Each breath was a promise to wake, and each dream a reminder that someday they would not. But they did not see that as tragedy. Death was only another form of rest. The sagas speak of warriors saying before battle, "I will sleep soon, and if I wake in Odin's hall, so be it." Rest was always linked to return. Maybe that's why their language used the same words for sleep and death in so many verses. To fall asleep could mean to die. To wake could mean to live again. Every night contained both possibilities. When morning came and frost cracked against the windows, they thanked the gods not just for survival, but for the dreams that had come. Some wrote their meanings on wood. Others simply whispered them to the fire. The dead had spoken, and for one more day, the living had listened. They rose, shaking snow from the roof, breathing steam into the pale air. Another night survived, another message received from beneath the frozen soil. And somewhere beyond the hills, the mounds of their ancestors slept on, quiet for now, until darkness returned and the living closed their eyes once more. But the most haunting part of their nights was not the fear of dying. It was the fear of being left behind by the dead. They believed love could make the grave restless. When someone passed in winter and could not yet be buried, their spirit lingered inside the house like the echo of a voice. People swore they heard footsteps near the door or the creak of the bed where the body had once lain. A widow might wake to the feeling of her husband's hand brushing her hair, or the weight of a familiar warmth beside her. No one screamed. They simply whispered, "I know. I'll wait too." Sometimes these visitations lasted for weeks, ending only when the body could finally be laid beneath the earth. In the sagas, this is spoken of not as horror, but as devotion. The boundary between love and haunting had not yet hardened into fear. In one old Icelandic account, a woman dreamed her husband returned from his burial mound each night to sit by the fire. He said nothing, only watched the flames. When she told the village seer, the old woman said, "He comes because the fire forgets no faces. Keep the embers bright, and he will fade when the night shortens." The widow obeyed. She never let the flame go out, and one morning he was gone. Modern readers might see grief, hallucination, and trauma, but the Vikings saw communication, a bridge between breath and stillness. They had no word for haunting in the Christian sense. The dead were not trapped, they were simply nearby. This nearness shaped their burial customs. They did not hurry death away. They spoke to it, prepared it, honoured it. When a body was dressed for burial, every action mattered. The mouth was closed so no breath escaped to wander. The eyes were covered to keep the soul from getting lost. Hands were folded to show surrender. Then, before sealing the grave, someone would whisper the person's name 3 times, to remind the spirit who it was. Without memory, the dead could not find peace. Even the ground itself was chosen carefully. High mounds for chieftains, close fields for kin, near doorways for infants. Each place where the living would still pass and remember. Walking near the graves was not something to avoid. It was a way to stay connected. The earth was not a wall. It was a conversation. There are runestones that still carry this belief in carved silence. Names, prayers, a plea written in stone. Let the mind remember him kindly. Some even end with a request to the passer-by. Say his name aloud. It was believed that speaking the dead's name kept them warm. And when the night came, people told stories beside the fire about those buried outside. Stories that turned loss into legacy. A child would ask where her grandfather slept, and her mother would point through the window to the mound glowing faintly under moonlight and say, "He sleeps close." That's why the fire burned steadily. Sometimes, when storms were loud and wind tore at the roofs, people said the dead joined the weather, that the roar of the gale was their marching, their voices calling across the snow. To fall asleep during such a night was not fearsome, it was comforting. They believed the ancestors were keeping watch, reminding the living that no storm ever lasted forever. In one legend from the Orkney Islands, a warrior killed in battle was buried by the shore. His widow built her hut beside the mound so she could sleep close to him. Each night she dreamed of waves breaking and of his voice calling her name. One morning she walked into the surf and never returned. The villagers said the sea had accepted her, not as a punishment, but as a reunion. Such stories were common. Death was not exile, it was migration. The dead moved from the warmth of the hearth to the warmth of the soil. To sleep beside them, to dream of them, was to stay part of that cycle. They had a word for this peace. Frida, meaning not simply rest, but balance. A state where nothing is lost, only changed. When the living slept and dreamed of the dead, they believed Frida had been achieved for that night. The world was complete. The line we draw between death and sleep, they blurred it intentionally. They knew that both began with the same gesture. A closing of the eyes, a surrender to something larger. One temporary, one eternal. But each demanding faith that the dawn, in some form, would still come. And so they slept side by side with the memory of their dead, unafraid, because they understood something we have forgotten, that the distance between the living and the lost is no wider than the space between breaths. How the Vikings built their nights to survive the cold. They did not sleep as we do, soft, separate, secure. Their beds were not invitations to rest, they were shields against the elements. Every night was construction, a battle to build warmth out of breath and wood. The architecture of sleep in Viking times was as much a survival tool as a sword or a ship. It was engineered for endurance. Imagine the landscape first. No sound but wind, no comfort but fire. Snow pressed against the outer walls, muting the world into silence. Inside, space was precious. Wood smoked, furs steamed, and every surface held the trace of human hands. When darkness fell, the room changed from a workshop or hall into a fortress. Benches became beds, cloaks became roofs, and bodies became the insulation that kept life from freezing to death. They did not lie down alone. That was unthinkable. To sleep alone in the north was a kind of suicide. Families shared the same sleeping space. Men, women, children, slaves, and sometimes even animals. All arranged by need and status. The oldest and youngest near the centre, the strongest on the outer edge where the cold crept in through cracks in the wood. Their breath fogged the air in thin white ribbons. In those hours the entire house breathed as one body. At first it may sound suffocating. The smell of sweat, smoke, tallow and damp fur hung in the air so thick you could taste it. Yet that stench was life. It meant the air was warm enough to hold scent. In the open snow there was no smell at all, only cold, sharp nothingness. They built their beds low, near the floor, where air stayed warmer. No one wanted to be closest to the door. That was the cold corner, the dangerous one, where frost gathered in thin white veins and rats sometimes crept from beneath the walls. The bravest, almost expendable, slept there. Sometimes a warrior took that place out of pride. Sometimes a thrall was sent there out of duty. Either way, someone had to guard the threshold between safety and the dark. Their blankets were hide stitched from whatever animal had most recently died. Deer, sheep, bear if they were lucky. The furs were heavy, stiff with age and grease, smelling faintly of blood. Beneath them they lined the floor with hay or straw, which hissed softly as bodies shifted. In summer that straw might be replaced with woven mats of reeds or dried grass, but in winter nothing was wasted. The same bed that kept you alive might later feed your animals. It was a world where comfort was borrowed, never owned. Every bit of warmth was temporary. Every fire burned down. Everybody cooled, so they learned to use rhythm instead. People took turns sleeping in layers. The first group lay down early, while others stayed awake to keep the fire fed. When the embers glowed low, the watchers would wake the sleepers to trade places. This rhythm kept movement alive inside the room, the human heartbeat of the long night. It also meant no one ever slept for long. True rest came only in fragments. The body adapted, they learned to fall asleep in moments, to wake without confusion. Some could lie down and be dreaming before their heads touched the furs. They called this gift svefenskjotur, sleep swift. It was a skill envied by all, because in that world every second of warmth mattered. But even in their rest, they were never still. Someone always shifted, someone coughed, someone rose to urinate in the snow and returned with a gust of icy air that made everyone groan. The house was alive, restless, like an animal breathing in its den. They placed the fire not in the centre, but slightly to one side, leaving a path open for smoke to escape through the roof vent. Too much flame, and you risked suffocation. Too little, and you froze. The fire was not just light. It was balanced. Each sparks a negotiation between death by ice and death by breath. There are remains of sleeping platforms found in old farmsteads. Planks built into the walls, sometimes with carvings of protection, spirals, hammers, sunwheels. These were not decorations, they were wards. Carved into the grain were silent prayers that the sleepers would wake. In one site, archaeologists found the bones of a dog curled where the master's bed once stood, a companion perhaps, still guarding him long after both had turned to dust. Even architecture bowed to fear. Ceilings were low to trap heat, doorways narrow to keep drafts from entering. The Vikings understood their environment better than we give them credit for. They were engineers of necessity. The homes they built were not comfortable, but they worked. They created a microclimate of survival. Human heat contained within timber and trust. And within that space, the act of sleeping itself became a communal ritual. Before lying down, each person prepared the bed as if readying for a voyage. Furs checked, coals covered, weapons close. A spear or axe often rested beside the sleeper, not from paranoia, but tradition. Enemies came at dawn. Everyone knew that the most vulnerable hour was the one before light returned. If you were a traveller, the rules changed. Strangers were given the outer edge, nearer to cold and risk. Hospitality was sacred, but so was caution. A guest might be kin or curse. So they offered bread, a drink, and a spot by the door. Sleep well, they'd say. But they never turned their backs until the stranger's breathing steadied. Sometimes when storms howled and wind tore at the walls, the people sang softly to keep rhythm with the creaking beams. The songs weren't lullabies, they were spells to calm the wood, to remind it not to split. The rhythm of their voices matched the rhythm of their fear. Sleep in that world was always temporary. A pause, never a guarantee. The Vikings treated it like an agreement with something ancient, an understanding between life and death. I'll close my eyes for a while. You can wait until morning. And yet, despite the fear, they found beauty in it. There are poems from the later sagas that speak of the sound of snow falling outside while lovers slept inside, and how that silence felt like a blessing. One fragment reads, "The house breathed with us. The dark held its breath." Even then they recognised that survival itself could be sacred. Archaeologists have uncovered sleeping rooms where fire soot stained every surface. The beams blackened, the walls slick with tar. Yet among the ruins they sometimes find small carvings hidden behind panels, faces of gods, protective runes, tiny crosses added centuries later when Christianity spread, layer after layer of belief built into the wood, pagan prayers overlaid with Christian hope, both asking for the same thing, one more morning. When dawn finally came, the sleepers stirred like a single creature waking. The air was thick with steam from melting frost. Children yawned. Someone prodded the fire to life again. The smoke rose and clung to the ceiling, like ghosts reluctant to leave. And then slowly they began to speak. About dreams, about noises, about who had snored too loud or stolen the best fur. The architecture of their sleep was simple, but its purpose was profound. They had built not comfort, but community. They survived the night by becoming one body. In a land where cold could erase a village in a single storm, warmth was the closest thing to holiness. The fire crackled again. Someone laughed, the sound raw and human against the endless wind outside. And for a brief moment, before work began and the day reclaimed its weight, the people of the North simply existed. Alive, breathing, safe. They had not conquered the night, but they had endured it. And in the world they built from wood and courage, that was enough. Even the smallest detail in their sleeping spaces carried meaning. The way the wood was joined, the way the walls breathed, all of it was designed with memory. The Norse didn't just build homes, they built containers for life. Each beam, each nail, was a promise to endure the cold and the gods' indifference. Some nights, when storms roared like beasts outside, the walls themselves seemed alive. The timbers groaned as if speaking, answering the wind's growl with their own. The people inside didn't fear it. They murmured back, treating the house as a living ally. They touched the wall beside them, whispering, "Hold." The structure wasn't separate from them. It was a companion, one that ate smoke, exhaled warmth, and shared the burden of survival. You could tell the wealth of a household by the sound of its night. The poor slept in silence, the fire barely crackling, their furs stiff with old sweat and salt. The rich slept to the hum of burning oak, the hiss of fat lamps, the faint jingle of ornaments hung above the hearth to ward off misfortune. But even the richest still lay shoulder to shoulder with others. No one had privacy in the north. There was no solitude in sleep, only layers of breath and body. The air inside those rooms was thick, sometimes hard to breathe. Smoke clung low, leaving a haze that stung the eyes but softened the light. It blurred faces until everyone looked like a ghost of themselves. Yet that haze was protection. It coated everything in warmth, sealing cracks, muffling sound. Children learned to fall asleep coughing, half smiling through it, because the sting meant safety. Archaeologists once unearthed the remains of a longhouse in Borg, its floor still lined with the impressions of woven mats. Among them, they found small stones arranged in circles, the base for oil lamps that had burned beside sleepers centuries ago. It's easy to imagine those circles glowing faintly in the dark, like constellations scattered across a wooden sky. Each lamp is a private sun guarding its cluster of dreams. Before lying down, people performed small gestures that meant everything. A mother would shake the furs to release trapped ice, pat the straw flat, and trace a rune of protection, often algiz, shaped like a branching tree, onto the beam above her family's heads. A man would test his weapon's edge one last time, not to fight, but to reassure himself that readiness was still possible. Then the fire was banked, the room dimmed, and silence descended like snow. In that closeness, human sound became music, the rhythm of dozens of people breathing, shifting, sighing. It created a strange harmony, almost hypnotic. You could measure time by it. Old women said they could tell who was sick or who was dreaming just by how the breathing changed. When a baby began to cry, the entire house adjusted. A mother stirred, another offered a hand, the firelight brightened. The community's heartbeat found its rhythm again. Outside, the dark pressed harder. The walls shuddered, snow slithered down the roof, and wind clawed at the door. Yet inside, warmth grew like a pulse. Sometimes travellers from the south wrote that stepping into a Viking home felt like entering the body of an animal. Hot, loud, alive, and heavy with scent. You could feel its heart beating in the fire. There was a strange intimacy in those nights. You could wake and see the outline of a stranger's face inches from yours. A thrall, a cousin, a neighbour, and still feel no fear. Survival had erased such distinctions. In sleep, everyone was equal. The cold didn't care about bloodlines, and neither did exhaustion. But that closeness could also be dangerous. Fire and air were constant enemies. Too much wood on the flames could choke the room with smoke before anyone woke. Too little, and they'd freeze before dawn. The balance was delicate. One heartbeat of mistake, and the whole household might not see morning, so they taught their children early how to listen for the change in sound. The subtle shift between safe warmth and smothering heat. There's a quiet heroism in that kind of vigilance. Every night was a negotiation with death, and the architecture itself was the language of that truce. The beam above you, the fur beneath you, the ember glowing near your face. All of it said the same thing. Stay alive until dawn. And when they woke, stiff and sore but still breathing, they didn't marvel at their endurance. They just rose, shook out the furs, added new straw, and began again. Because survival wasn't victory, it was routine. And every nail, every plank, every quiet act of care was a prayer written in wood. When Vikings believed the night could reveal fate itself, they did not dream like we do. For the Vikings, dreams were not flickers of imagination. They were messengers. Sleep was not escape from the world, but a door into it. Another battlefield where fate revealed its plans. To close your eyes was to enter a place the gods could reach you, and not everyone who received their touch felt blessed. They called dreams Draumar, and the word itself carried power. To say it aloud was to acknowledge that what you saw in the night mattered. The line between dream, vision, and prophecy was thin, almost meaningless. When a man dreamed of fire, he woke to prepare for death. When a woman dreamed of running water, she might expect a birth or a funeral. In the sagas, dreams are not metaphors, they are evidence. Kings delayed raids because of them. Wives wept when their husbands spoke of wolves. Prophets were those who could interpret the night correctly, who could listen to the gods without losing their minds. They believed the soul could leave the body during sleep. It wandered through the 9 realms, carried by Odin's ravens or by spirits of ancestors who wished to speak. Those journeys were dangerous. A soul could become lost and never return, leaving the body hollow. So before sleeping, some people tied cords around their wrists, symbolic tethers, to remind the wandering spirit where home was. Dreams came heavy in the north. The long dark pressed against the mind until thoughts twisted into shapes half real, half divine. A fisherman might see the ocean calling to him, waves shaped like arms. A mother might dream of her child covered in frost, only to wake and find the fire nearly dead. For them, there were no coincidences. Stories told of men who received warnings in sleep. Whispers from the dead. In one saga, a warrior dreamed that his brother appeared at the foot of his bed, covered in blood, saying only, "Don't go to sea." He ignored the dream. The next morning, the ice broke beneath his ship and swallowed it whole. In another tale, a woman dreamed of her husband's return from battle, not triumphant, but headless. Days later, his men carried his body home, wrapped in his own cloak. Such tales were not seen as superstition. They were records, proof that fate speaks softly before it shouts. To the Vikings, destiny was woven by the Norns, 3 women who spun, measured, and cut every life's thread. Dreams were glimpses of their weaving. When the strands trembled, the mind could sometimes catch the vibration. Those who did were marked by it. Seers, voleurs, and wise women were believed to live half inside that dream space, even while awake. They carried staffs carved with runes, wore cloaks of feathers or fur, and spoke in trance-like whispers. Sleep for them was a ceremony. Not everyone welcomed such gifts. To dream too vividly was dangerous. It meant you were too close to the gods, and gods could be cruel. People who saw too much often lost touch with the living world. They would wake shaking, unable to speak, their eyes wide as if they'd looked directly into something no one should see. In winters, when food ran low and the firewood dwindled, dreams became darker. Hunger brought visions, not of feasts, but of ancestors calling from the mounds. Some said the dead fed on those dreams, drawing strength from their fear. A man who dreamed of eating might wake weaker than before. To fight such hauntings, charms were carved into bedposts, simple symbols, Thor's hammer, a spiral of sun, or the rune algies, the one that looked like a branch, meaning protection. Before sleep, the head of the household would trace it in the air above the fire. It was said to create a barrier between worlds, keeping nightmares at bay. But there was no keeping the prophecy away. The sagas tell of Queen Ragnhild, who dreamed that from her womb grew a tree whose branches spread over the entire land, a vision foretelling the birth of her son, Harald Fairhair, who would unite Norway. Another tale speaks of a farmer who dreamed that his fields burned, yet the flames gave light instead of pain. The next year his crops were destroyed by fire, but from the ashes he found iron buried, all that made his family rich for generations. Dreams could kill, or they could crown. Either way, they were never ignored. To the Vikings, even small dreams mattered. A traveller who dreamed of a white bear would take it as warning not to journey north. A dream of honey meant a good harvest. A dream of wolves howling. Betrayal. Entire journeys, marriages and raids were decided by these nocturnal verdicts. It is strange, perhaps, to imagine a world where every shadow behind the eyes carried meaning. But for them, that belief gave shape to the chaos. In a land that could freeze you in minutes, it was comforting to think that the gods still bothered to send warnings. Some dreams, though, were shared. Families sleeping shoulder to shoulder claimed they sometimes dreamed the same images, the same storm, the same voices. In one old Icelandic account, two brothers said they saw themselves hunting together in sleep, though one lay sick in bed and the other far away at sea. When the healthy brother returned home, the sick one was already dead, his face calm, as if he'd died still walking beside him. Maybe that was the meaning of their dreaming, connection in a world of isolation. The night could separate them from the living, but in dreams they found one another again. As dawn approached, dreams faded quickly. They treated that fading as sacred time, a breath between worlds. Before the light fully broke, people recited what they remembered aloud, so it would not be stolen by the morning wind. Then they cast it into fire or water, offering it back to the gods who had sent it. To the modern ear, these rituals sound strange. Yet even now, there is something ancient in how we wake from nightmares and feel their grip linger, as if part of us still lives in that older world, where sleep and death, memory and prophecy are all woven from the same cold thread. And so each night they laid down once more, uncertain of what waited beyond the closing of their eyes. They did not fear dreams because they might be false. They feared them because they might be true. There were nights when the boundary between dream and vision vanished completely. People said the gods grew restless in winter and used human sleep as their mirror. If you saw something strange, a bird made of light, a ship sailing through snow, a shadow wearing your own face, it meant that the divine had borrowed your mind for a moment. You were the glass they looked through. The sagas are filled with such stories, small glimpses of prophecy tucked inside the rhythm of daily life. In the Vatnsdæla saga, a woman named Thordis dreamed of a great wave crashing over her house. She woke screaming, certain it meant ruin. Days later, raiders burned the farm and the flames rose as high as that dreamt wave. In the Laxdæla saga, a man dreamed of a golden falcon perching on his hand. A sign, the elders said, that he would gain power but lose peace. By spring he had become a chieftain, and by winter he was dead. Dreams were language. The trick was knowing how to translate. Some people became experts in that translation. The spakonur, women of sight, were summoned to interpret what others could not bear to understand. They spoke softly, half asleep themselves, as if the dream world still held them by the wrist. The firelight shimmered on their beads and furs, the sound of their staff tapping the ground in rhythm with their words. They would not simply explain a dream, they would step into it, closing their eyes and describing what the dreamer had seen as if they had been there too. For them, the boundary between night and day was meaningless. They drifted between both, belonging to neither. The villagers feared and adored them in equal measure. You did not thank a dream seer. You avoided her eyes and left offerings of meat or wool by her door, praying she would not see too much. But prophecy was not always grand. Sometimes it came in humble, quiet ways. A man might dream of a broken tool and wake to find his axe cracked. A woman might dream of strangers at her table, and within a week travellers would arrive. In a world where every day was uncertain, these moments gave shape to chaos. They told the Vikings that nothing was random, that even suffering was threaded with design. Still, some dreams terrified them. The drama that showed death were unavoidable and precise. A warrior who dreamed of his own blood knew it was a warning, not a possibility. When such dreams came, people prepared. They wrote wills, sharpened blades, and made peace with those they had wronged. They called it listening to the Norns. To ignore a death dream was to insult fate itself. In one account, a farmer named Einar dreamed that his sheep spoke to him, saying, "You will be where we are soon." He laughed at the absurdity. A month later, a snowstorm buried him in the pasture. The sheep were found alive, standing above the drift where he had fallen. The old said the gods had been kind to warn him. He simply didn't listen. Modern scholars might call this coincidence pattern-making psychology, but for the Vikings, belief itself was protection. To take a dream seriously was to respect the order of the world. The gods favoured those who paid attention. And perhaps they were right. Because even now the human mind still obeys those same ancient rhythms. We dream to process what we fear, to see what waking life refuses to show us. The Vikings just had the courage to call those visions real. They didn't dissect them, they lived by them. Sometimes a dream could save a life. In one saga, a woman saw a figure standing outside her door, dripping with seawater, its hair tangled with ice. It whispered her husband's name. She woke him, insisting they move their boat farther inland before dawn. By morning the tide had broken the harbour wall. Every vessel but theirs was gone. They told that story for generations, not because of what it proved, but because of what it reminded them. That the gods never stopped speaking. Only humans stopped listening. And when they lay down again after such dreams, there was no fear. If death came, it would not come unannounced. The Norns had already written it, in thread and smoke and sleep. The Vikings only had to read it, live it, and, when the time came, rest in it. For them, prophecy was not about control, it was about peace. To see fate and accept it, that was the highest wisdom. And perhaps that is why they slept so deeply after all, when the cold itself became a voice in the mind. There were nights in the north when the world simply stopped making sound. The snow fell so thick it swallowed every echo. You could scream into the wind, and it would vanish before reaching your own ears. In that silence, something inside the human heart began to shift. The Vikings called those winters Fimbulveta, the Great Winter, the Endless One. It was not just a season, but a state of existence, a test of the soul. The sagas said it would come again before the end of the world, when wolves would swallow the sun and the sea would freeze from shore to shore. But for those who lived through the long nights of the north, the apocalypse was already familiar. It came every year, when the sky refused to brighten and the air turned heavy with frost. Inside the small wooden houses, there was no sound beyond breathing and the faint crackle of the fire. The ear longed for something. A voice, a footstep, even the cry of a bird. But the snow buried all signs of life. When people spoke, their words felt strange, too loud, bouncing against the stillness like stones thrown into an empty cave. Some said the silence itself was alive, that it crept in from the mountains, seeping through the cracks, settling on the skin like invisible frost. It had weight. It pressed down on the mind until even thoughts began to echo. Children grew restless. Adults grew distant. Faces turned pale not just from lack of sun, but from the quiet that gnawed at them. In such isolation, people began to hear things that were not there. The mind, desperate for sound, created its own. A soft tapping. A branch. A heartbeat. Whispers curling from the corners of the room. The Vikings believed those whispers belonged to spirits, sometimes to ancestors, sometimes to the land itself. Silence, they said, was how the other world spoke. There are records from later travellers who described old Norse families burning herbs or animal fat simply to make crackling noise, to break the spell of stillness. Others sang, not from joy, but from fear of going mad. A house too quiet was a dangerous thing. When a man sat alone by the dying fire, staring into the coals for too long, people would whisper that he was listening to the frost, and that soon the frost would start listening back. In the endless dark, even time changed its texture. Hours stretched until they no longer had meaning. Days blended together like snowflakes melting on the same field. People began to speak slower, move slower, think slower. The brain itself seemed to freeze along with the land. Some forgot the sound of their own voices. Others began to talk in their sleep, just to remind the night they still existed. The sagas mention men who walked out into the snow and never returned. They were not driven by despair, but by something quieter, a hunger for sound. They said the wind had called to them. When their bodies were found weeks later, they were sitting upright in the drifts, eyes open, faces calm. It was as if they had finally heard whatever had been whispering all winter. To fight this creeping madness, the Vikings invented rhythm. They worked even when there was nothing to work on. They carved wood, twisted rope, beat hides, hummed songs without words, anything to make noise. The steady repetition anchored them to the physical world. Without it, thought dissolved into the same grey blur as the landscape outside. They also created stories, myths born from the quiet. Tales of trolls beneath the ice, of unseen creatures that froze travellers with their gaze, of a god of silence who walked unseen between houses and took those who spoke too little or too much. These stories were warnings but also therapy. They gave form to what could not be named. Even the animals changed. Cows stopped mooing. Dogs barked less. Horses stood still for hours, their breath forming small clouds in the dark. People took that as a sign that nature itself was listening. So they lowered their voices, as if speaking too loudly might wake something vast and sleep in the snow. The old believed that too much silence could draw death. They told of one winter when a village decided not to celebrate Yule. No feasting, no songs, no drums, because food was scarce and spirits were heavy. The following spring, half the people were dead. They said it was because they'd forgotten to make noise. After that, no matter how cold or hungry they were, they always sang in midwinter. Even if their throats cracked from dryness, even if their songs were only whispers, they filled the air. It wasn't joy, it was defiance. Archaeologists have found evidence of these gatherings. Broken drums, carved flutes, hollow bones that once served as whistles. Tools not of entertainment, but of survival. Because music to them was warmth. Each sound reminded the world it was still alive. Still the silence always returned. In the final hours before dawn, when the fire had burned low and the songs had ended, there would be nothing. Just the faint hiss of snow against the roof and the slow pulse of blood in the ears. People learned to fear that moment most, the pause between night and morning, when even the gods seemed to hold their breath. Some villagers burned their own roofs in desperation, just to hear the crack and roar of flame. The light was worth the loss. Others left their houses to stand in the open, faces turned upward, begging the sky to make a sound. The aurora shimmered above them, silent, mocking, beautiful. They swore they could feel its noise in their bones, even if no one could hear it. By the end of each winter, when the first crow finally cawed and the ice began to melt, many wept without knowing why. The noise was overwhelming, almost painful. The world was speaking again. The silence retreated into the mountains, waiting for next year. The Vikings endured it as they endured everything else. But deep inside, they carried that quiet with them. It became part of their faith, part of their fear. In their mythology, even the end of the world begins with silence. No thunder, no scream, only a stillness so deep it feels holy. And maybe they were right, because in that silence, stripped of warmth and sound and comfort, they met the raw truth of existence. That between every heartbeat there is a pause, and in that pause lives both terror and peace. The silence was not always absent. Sometimes it spoke. There were people who claimed they could hear music inside it, low, pulsing tones that came from nowhere, like the deep hum of the earth itself. Others said they heard breathing in the snow, slow and steady, matching their own. The old called that sound Jördasungur, the song of the land. It was said to lull some to sleep and drive others mad. When the darkness stretched too long, even the bravest minds began to twist. The Vikings knew it. They had words for the sickness of the cold. Hugviki, the illness of thought. The afflicted would grow distant, speaking to no one, staring into empty corners. Then one morning they would walk out into the frost barefoot, saying they were following a sound no one else could hear. Their footprints always led toward the mountains. To protect against that pull, they built rituals of noise. Every few nights they would strike shields with sticks or hammers, beating rhythm into the walls. Not for war, but for sanity. They called it the waking of the house. Each clang reminded the wood it was still alive. reminded the gods that voices still echoed among the living. The vibration shook loose the heaviness that crept into the chest during too much quiet. At the heart of it all was rhythm, the oldest medicine. They drummed on barrels, clapped their hands, stomped the floor in patterns that grew wild, desperate, until laughter replaced fear. Even the children joined in. They danced with exhaustion, shouting into the air just to hear something answer. And in that sound, in that defiance, they found life again. One story tells of a family who survived an entire winter alone after their neighbours perished. They sang every night to keep from falling into despair. When spring came and travellers finally reached them, they found the family thin and trembling, but alive. The visitors asked how they had endured. The father said, "We sang until the silence left us." Even now, the ruins of longhouses reveal evidence of that need for noise. Grooves carved into walls where sticks had struck wood. Soot-stained beams splintered from drumming. What archaeologists call damage was, in truth, survival marks. The scars of sound carved into the architecture of fear. But not every house could win that battle. Some succumbed to the silence completely. There are tales of farms abandoned midwinter, food untouched, fires dead, doors open to the wind. When spring thawed the drifts, searchers found the inhabitants lying peacefully, faces turned toward one another as if asleep. The old explanation was simple. The frost had taken them. But in the whispers that lasted long after, people said the quiet had called them home. In the Viking mind, silence had personality. It was neither friend nor enemy. It was a test and witness. To survive, it was to be reshaped by it. Those who endured the longest winters learned to love that silence the way sailors love the sea. Never trusting it, but unable to live without it. Because beneath the fear there was something almost holy in that stillness. The kind of quiet where you could hear your own pulse, your own thoughts, the steady rhythm of your breath. The kind of quiet where, for a fleeting moment, the line between yourself and the world dissolved. The Vikings feared the silence, but they also understood it better than we do. It was their mirror, reflecting both the danger and the grace of being alive. And when the first birds returned in spring, their cries split that vast, frozen stillness like a blade. People would pause in their work and listen, smiling, weeping, unable to speak. Not because they were sad, but because the silence had ended, and something inside them had ended with it. They had looked into the void, and the void had listened back, the ones who never slept. Because someone had to listen to the dark. Every village had one, a man or woman who stayed awake when the others surrendered to sleep. Not a warrior, not a chief, just someone chosen to keep watch while the night pressed its ear against the walls. The Vikings called them Vetervörder, the Winter Watchers. To hold that post was both honour and punishment. It meant you were trusted. It also meant you were alone. Their task was simple. Keep the fire alive, keep the wolves away, and listen. Yet what they listened for was not always human. The north was too vast, too empty, to believe that only flesh moved beneath its snow. When the world outside froze solid, sound carried for miles. A single crack of ice could echo like a scream. The watchers learned to tell the difference between shifting wood and footsteps, between wind and whisper. They sat by the hearth, wrapped in fur, eyes half closed, a knife in one hand and a poker in the other. The firelight flickered across their faces, drawing and erasing the same lines of fear over and over again. At first the silence seemed safe. Then it began to breathe. Some said they could hear voices in the wind, not words but shapes of sound that curled around the eaves like smoke. Others claimed to hear the fire speak, its hissing patterns repeating like speech in a forgotten tongue. A few went mad from it. They said the night was calling their name. No one ever questioned a watcher who refused to take another turn. They knew what the dark could do. In the oldest settlements, the duty rotated. Every able adult took a night each week. But as winters grew harsher and stories grew darker, fewer volunteered. People began to say that once you heard the night clearly, It never stopped following you. The wind would find you even in your dreams. So they began to choose their watchers carefully. Some believed women heard the whispers better. Gentler minds, they said, closer to the spirits. Others insisted only men had the strength to face what came out of the woods. In truth, it was never about strength. It was about endurance. The will to stay awake when everything in your body begged for rest. There are sagas that mention these watchers. In the Vatnsdæla saga, a man named Ingimund was said to keep vigil for 12 nights straight, claiming that if he closed his eyes, the house would fall. When he finally collapsed, the roof beam split in two. The story was told for generations, not as proof of magic, but as proof that the night had to be respected. Sometimes watchers reported seeing figures in the snow. Not men, not beasts, something between. They described them as shadows with breath. No footprints, no sound, just the shifting of the darkness itself. When morning came, nothing remained but smooth, untouched drifts, and the watcher's face, pale, hollow, the eyes red from unshed tears. To stay awake that long changed a person. The mind began to split, sounds grew sharper, shadows twitched. The watcher began to imagine faces in the fire, movements in the smoke. Some claimed to see ancestors there watching back. A few even spoke to them. It wasn't all madness. The role had practical reasons too. In villages where raids could come at any hour, or where wild animals prowled close, a wakeful guard could mean survival. He was the first to see the glow of distant torches, the glint of eyes beyond the trees. But practicality could not erase the spiritual weight of the job. Everyone knew that the one who faced the night faced more than enemies. They were taught small rituals to survive the silence. Keep the fire speaking. Stir the logs every hour so the crackle never dies. Whisper your own name occasionally to remind the dark that you belong to the living. Never stare into the snow for too long. The mind will invent things that stare back. Children were warned never to approach a watcher during his shift. He was half between worlds then, listening for things they should not hear. If a child woke and saw him by the hearth, they were told to stay quiet. The watcher's ears were not his own at that hour. Sometimes the villagers would find strange marks near the house after a long night. Spirals carved into the frost, or circles of melted snow, as if something warm had stood there watching the watcher. No one ever tried to explain them. In one Icelandic story, a woman kept vigil while her husband was away. She claimed she heard footsteps circling the walls for hours, slow and heavy, dragging across the snow. At dawn she followed them, and found that they began and ended at the same place just outside the door. No entry, no exit. As if something had walked from the dark to listen, then vanished where it stood. Watchers rarely lived long. They aged fast, faces lined from sleepless winters. But they were respected. When one died, his body was burned with the same honours as a warrior. People said he had fought a different kind of enemy, the one that came when the fire dimmed. In some graves, archaeologists have found bones with soot stains on the fingers, as if those hands had lived their lives turning logs in silence. Beside them, small iron tools, maybe pokers or hooks, now rusted away. No swords, no shields, just the relics of endurance. There's a line from a late saga that captures it best. He who guards the night guards all men. The watchers carried the weight of everyone's dreams. They stayed awake so others could surrender. And when dawn finally came, they were the first to see it. That faint blue bleeding through the black sky. That thin thread of light crawling across the snow. They would sigh, shake their heads, and whisper thanks to the gods for one more morning. The others would wake to warmth and laughter, never knowing what had circled them in the dark. And the watcher, eyes raw and heavy, would crawl into a fur pile and finally sleep. Not deeply, not peacefully, but enough. Because in that world, sleep was not a gift, it was a reward. And for those who had listened to the dark all night, it was the only one that mattered. The first hour is easy. The house still remembers the voices. The fire talks back when you feed it. A soft hiss, a low crackle. You sit with the poker across your knees and tell yourself you are only listening to wood. You are not listening to the wind. You are not listening to the dark. By the second hour, the breaths of the sleepers have braided into one rope of sound. You can tell who is where with your eyes closed. The child that wheezes, the old woman who breathes like a tide, the hunter who holds air too long and lets it go as if it were a secret slipping from his mouth. You test the coal with the tip of the iron and tuck a new stick under the ash until it glows at the edges like a tooth in a closed mouth. The third hour begins when the house stops settling. No new clicks from the rafters. No straw whispers beneath shifting bodies. Everything holds its breath to see if you can. Your ears grow wider than your skull. You hear melt and refreeze, tiny crystals falling from the eaves, each a fingernail on stone. You lift your head at nothing more than the thought of a footstep. You talk to yourself without moving your lips. Names of the gods, then names of the living, then names of the dead. Not prayers, anchors. The words keep you in your body. When your mind tries to wander, it trips over a name and returns. There is a moment each night when your eyes invent a figure in the corner, a coat hung on a peg, a bundle of nets, the shape of a person standing too still. You do not look directly at it, because you know it will resolve into what it is, and then return to what it was, and you will have to decide which is true. Instead, you feed the fire. You listen to the coal make a sound like rain, trapped under your skin. Outside, something changes in the snow. Not movement, weight. The dark leans. You feel it in the door plank first, a grain-deep shiver that travels into your wrist where your palm rests on the wood. You lift the latch slowly and count to 12 without opening it, the old habit. Give the night time to remember it does not want you. When you crack the door, the cold comes in like a hand. The moonlight is a knife sheathed in clouds. There are no tracks. There is only the silver surface of the world, unbroken, that looks back at you like an eye. You close the door and the fire looks brighter for a heartbeat, proud that you came back. You tell it a story you barely remember, about a man who sat up 12 nights until the beam split and the snow came into the room in a perfect square. It is a warning disguised as a memory. The coal answers with a single snap. You drink from the wooden cup, and the water is a kind of pain. Your jaw aches from keeping still. You roll your shoulders, and your bones answer with their own small thunder. The house permits it. It knows the difference between the sounds of living and the sounds of loss. The hour between first sleep and second sleep arrives like a visitor who doesn't knock. The half-wakers stir. A child whimpers. A hand finds it in the dark without eyes. Someone sits up, breathes into the fire, and lies down again. For a little while the world is thicker with humans, and you could weep at the relief of it. Then it thins, the rope of breath tightens again. You are the knot, a soft scrape from beyond the wall. Not wind, not wood. You know those. This has intent. You do not reach for the axe, you reach for the poker. You lay its tip in the ember until it blushes, then lift it and hold the red near the door seam. Heat writes itself along the grain. Your breath fogs. On the other side, silence shifts its weight like a horse moving a hoof. You whisper your own name. Not loud, not a challenge, just a reminder to whatever is listening that you already belong to someone, yourself. When the sound comes again, it is higher. A paw, a hand, then nothing. You sit so still your teeth begin to hum. Time pours through you and leaves minerals. Your thoughts calcify into simple shapes. Keep the ember, count the heartbeats. Do not follow the sound the dark puts in your ear. It isn't yours. Your vision narrows until the fire is a single star, and the rest of the room is a sky that might not contain it. You hold the poker like a mast and ride the small weather of the flames. Stories arrive uninvited, your grandfather's boots frozen upright by the door, the way he laughed when they would not bend. The winter the river stopped speaking. The boy who loved to run on ice and fell into air instead of water because the snow had roofed the emptiness and called it land. You pushed the stories away, in case one of them is actually a hand reaching from the other side. You hear the house answer the cold again, A beam pops like a rib. You answer the house with a tap of iron on stone. 1, 2, 3. The old rhythm they taught you, so the wood will remember the music of people. Somewhere outside, the wind changes its mind. It goes from teeth to tongue, from bite to whisper. The door no longer leans. Your wrist forgets to be a seer and returns to being a wrist. There is always a bargain in the last hour. You pay it with a thought you do not want to think. You promise something you do not want to promise. Let them breathe, you offer. Take my sleep tomorrow, or the next night, or the week after. Take the laughter I would have had when the fish ran. Leave me the fire this once. The dark is a market with no stallkeeper, yet you feel the price accepted. The ember brightens by a feather. You know dawn is coming before the first colour, because the silence loses weight. It becomes distance instead of pressure. The breath rope loosens. Someone sighs and it sounds like a summer sound. The frost on the beam above the hearth turns from hard white to something wet that remembers the word drop. You tilt your head and the house tilts with you. When the blue finally threads itself through the seam of the door, you feel it in your throat. The night unknots. You lift ash with the back of the poker and the coal underneath opens its one red eye and looks at you with recognition. You feed it, a thin stick. It takes it. Flame grows like a decision being made. They wake. Names answer. The count is whole. Someone laughs. The laugh people laugh when they have nothing and everything at once. You place the poker down as if it were a child you have carried too long. Your hands are black. Your eyes gritty with ghosts. The watchers always look older in the morning, as if the dark had pressed its thumb into the clay of your face to see if it would hold a shape. You crawl into a warm place that is still warm from someone else. You do not sleep so much as fall through yourself. As you go, you hear the day begin its noise. Wood split, water struck from ice, a voice telling a story about a sound it didn't hear. The night lingers at the edge of the room, polite now, already turning into memory. Just before it leaves, it says your name the way wind says the name of a hill, which is to say it doesn't. You answer anyway, but only inside your mouth. You have listened to the dark and kept it secret, that it is smaller than the ember you protected, how a single flame stood between life and the end of the world. They treated fire like a living god. It breathed, it ate, it demanded attention. In the north, to let it die was almost a sin, a betrayal of every ancestor who had survived the dark before you. Each home's flame was descended from another, passed by torch or coal from neighbour to neighbour, village to village. There was no such thing as making fire in the middle of winter. You inherited it. They called it elder, but that word meant more than flame. It meant warmth, light, spirit, life. Fire was a guest that had to be fed. It slept lightly, like a child with nightmares, and if it woke in anger, it could consume everything. When people lay down at night, the fire was the last thing they saw, and the first thing they thought of when they opened their eyes. A single ember was enough. A glowing heart, hidden under ash, preserved through the long silence of sleep. If that ember died, someone would have to brave the night to steal the flame from another house. Sometimes that journey was short. Sometimes it was across a frozen field in the wind that sliced through skin. A man could lose fingers trying to keep a spark alive in his hands. But he did it anyway, because without fire, morning never came. The fire watcher's job was sacred. Each family had one, often the eldest or the most responsible, sometimes the person too injured to work, but still strong enough to guard the flame. They sat by the hearth through the hours when the rest of the world vanished. The fire's voice was the only sound, the soft sigh of wood surrendering to heat, the quiet hiss of sap bursting into light. In those moments, the Vikings believed they were not alone. The fire was listening. It remembered everything said in its presence. That's why confessions and arguments were often whispered near it, to make sure the truth was witnessed. The gods could hear through fire. It was their messenger. When storms raged and snow buried the doors, families would gather around the flame as if it were an altar. They told stories to keep the fire entertained, myths of creation, of the first spark stolen from the gods. The tale went that once, long ago, humankind had lived in eternal night until a nameless wanderer climbed the spine of the world and stole a burning coal from the sun itself. He hid it inside a hollow bone and brought it down to earth. From that act, every fire was born. To let it die was to return the world to that first darkness. Children grew up believing that the flame could think. If they were cruel near it, it would spit and burn them. If they treated it kindly, it would shine warmer. When sparks leapt, they said the fire was laughing. When it hissed, it was angry. When it burned low, it was tiring. And when a loved one died, people sometimes whispered their names into the smoke, believing the fire carried them upward, a final breath sent toward the gods. Archaeologists still find traces of this faith in old hearths, layers of ash mixed with herbs and tiny bones. Offerings, left to keep the flame fed, sometimes even coins, half melted by heat. A strange currency between the living and the unseen. The hearth was the true centre of the Viking home. Not the doorway, not the chieftain's chair, but the place where light met darkness. Around it, everything else was built: beds, benches, storage, life itself. The roof vent above it served as both chimney and eye. Through that hole, smoke escaped, prayers drifted, and spirits entered. It was said that the gods themselves could pass through, on nights when offerings burned bright enough to reach the sky. When a family moved, they did not leave their fire behind. They scooped a coal into a clay pot, packed it in moss, and carried it to the new home. That same ember might have warmed a dozen generations. It was a heritage made of heat. The fire also had its moods. It could turn cruel without warning. A single spark could undo everything. The sagas are filled with fires that destroy entire halls, sometimes by accident, sometimes by vengeance. A jealous lover, a drunken feud, a god's wrath disguised as coincidence. When the flames took control, people didn't curse them, they begged for forgiveness. They saw in fire the same duality they saw in themselves, a capacity for warmth and destruction. It was Loki and Balder in the same body, mischief and light, deceit and life. Each winter during Yule they honoured this paradox. They built great bonfires, not to banish the dark, but to make peace with it. Around those fires, they sang to remind the gods that humans still remembered their covenant. The flames leapt high into the black sky, their smoke mingling with the northern lights until it seemed as if the heavens themselves were burning. And yet, when the festival ended and the bonfires died, every person carried a coal home in silence. That single ember was the thread between celebration and survival. It had to live until dawn. There are old Norse sayings that linger in fragments. A home without fire is a home without soul. The man who forgets to feed his flame will forget his own name. Because for them warmth was memory. It was continuity. The fire that burned in your home was the same one that burned in your parents and your grandparents before them. When it flickered, you felt their absence. When it glowed strong, you felt their presence. As the long nights deepened and the watchers grew tired, they would sometimes stare into the coals until their own faces appeared there. Small, flickering reflections in the red light. That moment was sacred. Seeing yourself inside the fire reminded that life was temporary, glowing, fragile, and necessary. When morning came, they buried the embers in ash, muting their colour, but keeping their heat. They'd stir them again that night, watching the fire breathe back to life. The cycle never ended. Flame to ember, ember to flame. Death and rebirth every single day. And through it all, they believed the gods watched through the smoke. Balder, the bright one, whose death by fire would one day mark the beginning of the world's end. And Loki, who hid in the flame's shadow, laughing as men prayed for mercy. The Vikings feared both, but they loved fire anyway. It was the only thing that stayed alive with them through every winter, the only creature that never truly slept. Because when all else froze, when men, animals, and even hope itself went still, the fire kept whispering in the dark. And that whisper more than prayer or weapon or strength, was what kept the North alive. At night, when the others finally surrendered to sleep, the fire spoke in a different voice. If you listened long enough, you could almost hear words forming inside its rhythm. Not language, but meaning. The Vikings said the fire knew everything that had ever happened in a room. Its smoke carried memory upward. Its light burned truth into wood. To lie beside it was to sleep under the gaze of an ancient witness. Children were told that fire saw the heart. If you fed it with greed, it smoked and stung the eyes. If you tended it with patience, it glowed clear and steady. The elders taught that a calm flame meant the gods were near and listening. A restless one meant the unseen were hungry. They believed the fire ate not only wood, but emotions. Rage made it burn too hot. Sorrow dimmed it. The best fires were born of balance. When travellers came from distant farms, the first thing they did was approach the hearth. They stretched their hands over it and whispered their names. A small introduction, a way of letting the household spirits know who had entered. No one sat until the flame flickered back in acknowledgement. It was like greeting a host. On the coldest nights, families told the story of Loki's theft, how he crept into the hall of the gods, stealing a spark meant only for them. He hid it inside a piece of birch bark and fled across the sky. When the gods pursued him, he dropped embers that fell to earth as lightning. From those strikes came the first mortal fires. The moral was simple. Fire is divine rebellion. It belongs to those bold enough to take it. Each generation guarded their ember, as if it were lineage itself. There were winters when a single coal kept an entire valley alive. If a family's fire went out, they sent their youngest to beg for a new spark, believing the innocence of youth protected it from dying on the way. The child would wrap the ember in moss and carry it home like a beating heart. When it caught again, the family would celebrate as though someone had been resurrected. The hearth became the centre of every ritual. Contracts were sworn before it, wounds cauterized by it, marriages blessed in its light. Even punishment sometimes involved it. A thief might be forced to walk around the fire 3 times, confessing his sin to the flame itself. The idea was not torture, but purification. The fire burned lies out of the air. There was tenderness too. Lovers whispered by the embers when the others slept, tracing shapes in the soot, seeing their faces reflected in the coppery glow. In those moments, the fire was a secret keeper, holding their warmth long after they turned away. Archaeologists have found traces of meals left untouched beside ancient hearths, charred bread, a bit of fat, a splash of mead. Offerings to the flame's appetite. They weren't mistakes, they were gifts, left to ensure the fire stayed loyal. A house whose fire turned against it was cursed. It meant the spirit within had grown lonely. In the old months of Yule, when the world tilted closest to darkness, people lit the log of promise, a single great trunk that burned for 12 nights. It was said to carry all the year's stories up to the gods. The more evenly it burned, the kinder the next winter would be. When it finally collapsed into ash, they scattered the remains across their fields for blessing. Even in death, fire gave life. To fall asleep in its glow was to surrender into the heart of the world. The heat on skin, the flicker through closed lids. It was like dreaming of sunrise before it came. Some said that souls left their bodies through the breath and travelled along the smoke, wandering above the rafters until the dream ended. That was why no one ever blew out a flame. They let it die on its own, gently, so the spirits could find their way back. In that respect, fire was more than survival. It was faith made visible. The Vikings didn't pray for light. They built it with their hands, fed it, kept it alive. Every spark was a fragment of defiance against the cold gods of death and frost. And perhaps that is why their nights never fully belonged to the dark. Even when snow buried the roofs and the wind erased all paths, there was always one pulse left beating in the heart of the house. That orange heartbeat of the fire, that stubborn echo of the sun. It watched over them like an old friend who never blinked. It listened, it remembered, and it promised, "As long as you feed me, morning will find you." how Vikings drifted between worlds when the night refused to end. They didn't sleep straight through the night. No one did, not when the dark lasted 16 hours and silence weighed like stone. The Vikings slept in two halves, Fyrsta Svifen and Annan Svifen, the first sleep and the second. Between them lay a strange twilight, an hour when bodies half woke and souls half wandered. It was not rest, it was ritual. They rose in that gap without knowing why. Some stirred the fire, others prayed or whispered to the gods. Lovers found each other in that soft half-light. Parents checked their children's breath. The world seemed to hover between death and dawn. In those moments their minds opened like doors. They said that dreams spilt out into the room. Unfinished visions searching for meaning. No one feared waking, it was expected. They believed the gods spoke most clearly then, when sleep loosened the knots of the body but hadn't yet released the spirit. The Norns could tug at a person's thread in that hour, showing flashes of what might come. If you saw a face, a fire, a road, it was advice, not an accident. The fire's glow was dim by then, buried under grey ash. Someone would prod it gently, coaxing the heart of it back to life. The spark would flare, and the whole house would breathe again. They believed it mattered how you tended the flame during that hour. If you were careless, if you let it gutter out, misfortune would follow you into the second sleep. Families sometimes spoke softly together then. They talked of the day that had passed, or the ones they hoped to see. It was the only time when the world felt slow enough to listen. Outside, the frost held everything still. Trees, rivers, even the air. Only the northern lights moved, shimmering faintly across the roof beams through the smoke hole. Children were told that if they opened the door in that hour, they might see ghosts walking. Not terrifying ones, but familiar shapes. Ancestors stretching their legs before returning to their mounds. The barrier between living and dead was thinner then. You could thank the spirits for keeping you through the night, but you must never follow them outside. That was the danger of the second sleep. Curiosity. Some people went out into the snow during that strange hour and never returned. The villagers said they had followed a dream too far. They became part of the silence, lost between worlds. Yet those who stayed inside found peace in it. They used that waking to meditate, to weave, to carve, to whisper charms over the sick. The mind was clearer then. In one saga, an old seeress said that all true visions came not in the sleep of the body, but in the waking of the soul. Scholars now know that broken sleep was natural in pre-industrial life, but to the Vikings, it was holy. They thought the gods had built that rhythm into the world itself, a breath between breaths. Sometimes the first sleep was filled with heavy dreams, battles, hunger, the faces of the dead. But after waking, the second sleep was gentler. People described it as deeper, calmer, like being carried rather than falling. It was the sleep of renewal. When they finally opened their eyes to dawn, they felt reborn, as if two small deaths had granted one more day of life. There are accounts of farmers lighting a candle or lamp during that middle hour and marking its wax each night, believing it measured the strength of the soul. If the candle burned evenly, their household would endure the winter. If it sputtered or cracked, someone inside would fall ill. The candle became a clock not of time, but of fate. This pattern shaped their daily rhythm. Work began late. Life adjusted around the darkness. They accepted it, even cherished it. The modern world fears sleeplessness as weakness, but the Vikings treated it as communion. That moment between sleeps was when they felt closest to whatever governed them. Gods, ancestors, or the deep instinct that linked them to the land itself. In those quiet hours, the house felt alive in a different way. The fire murmured, the snow outside sighed, and the people half dreaming felt themselves both inside and outside their own lives. They were watchers of their own breathing, witnesses to existence. By the time the second sleep took them again, the frost on the roof would have thickened, and the stars would have wheeled just slightly west. The body sank back under furs, heavy and warm, and the mind drifted into gentler visions. Less warning, more wonder. They dreamed of thawing rivers, of sunlight spilling through ice, of green fields they had never seen but somehow remembered. When morning finally broke, the light came pale and forgiving. They stretched, rubbed their faces, and stirred the fire back to brightness. The first act of every day was to thank the flame, and the second was to tell what they had dreamed. Those stories were not entertainment. They were reports from the night, intelligence from another realm. Through that rhythm of sleep and waking, they learned a truth modern people have forgotten, that rest is not absence, but conversation. The body speaks in silence, the gods answer in dreams, and between them lies the fragile space where life continues. The second sleep was that space, and in its quiet, the Vikings found the one thing that could outlast the darkness, the understanding that even in endless night there is always an hour meant for light. But the space between those two sleeps, that strange, hovering hour, held more than superstition. It was a living pause, a heartbeat between worlds. Sometimes the quiet between Fyrsta Svefn and Annan Svefn felt like another kind of consciousness altogether. The Vikings called it Midda Draumara, the middle dream. Not quite waking, not quite sleeping, but something deeper. A small window where the soul could travel and return. Farmers used that hour to rise and stir the hearth, to check that the embers still breathed. Hunters might step outside for a moment, staring at the frost mist curling from their mouths, half convinced they were watching their spirit leave and return with every exhale. Women sat upright in bed, their hair catching the orange firelight, whispering small prayers or counting their blessings for those who had survived the night so far. It was not fear that woke them, it was rhythm. The body, untethered from time. They didn't fight it, they leaned into it, used it. The first sleep healed the flesh, the second calmed the spirit. Between them was where the mind untangled itself, as if even the soul needed to stretch before resting again. There are fragments of old writings describing how lovers would meet in that hour, their hands finding each other in the darkness, speaking softly so the gods themselves wouldn't overhear. Between the sleeps, one line says, the heart remembers what daylight forgets. For others, that time was for stillness. They would lie awake, eyes half open, watching the fire's faint pulse and imagining it as the world's heart beating through the cold. Archaeologists have found signs that this practice was real. Lamps burned low, fire pits raked precisely at intervals that fit this rhythm. The ash layers in longhouse hearths show 2 distinct burns per night, as if someone always woke to coax life back into the coals before sleeping again. Even now, sleep scientists recognise this as the body's natural pattern before the industrial age. Our ancient inheritance of wakefulness within rest. And for the Vikings, that hour wasn't wasted time. It was when they listened. Some said the gods spoke through the sound of settling wood, or through the quiet creak of the roof beams expanding in the frost. If you listened carefully, you could hear your future, not as a prophecy, but as reassurance. A whisper from the world itself that said, "You are still here." Children were told that the stars moved differently between the two sleeps, that the constellations slowed their paths to wait for human dreams to catch up. Those who woke then sometimes claimed to see the northern lights faintly through the smoke vent, sliding across the sky in silence, as if the gods were writing something too bright for the waking world to read. And when they finally returned to their beds for the second sleep, it was not exhaustion that took them, it was surrender. The house had survived, the flame still lived, the night had spoken and done no harm. They could drift back under their furs with the deep, instinctive gratitude of people who knew that survival itself was holy. The second sleep was never simply more rest. It was the completion of a cycle, a slow exhale of the soul, a final nod to the dark before dawn reclaimed them. It was the moment when even the gods slept again. When waking was a victory and daylight felt like forgiveness. Each sunrise in the north was a miracle. Not guaranteed, not taken for granted, but earned. After the endless night, dawn came shyly. It did not burst across the sky like in warmer lands. It crept, a thin grey shimmer along the horizon, hesitant, almost embarrassed to return. People stirred at the first hint of it, uncertain whether it was truly light or just a trick of frost reflecting their fire. To wake in Viking times was not simply to open one's eyes, it was to survive. The morning air cut like a blade. When a sleeper did not move, no one rushed to shake them. They waited, held breath, watched for steam rising from the mouth. Only when a faint cloud appeared did relief spill quietly through the room. A sigh, a whisper, a thank you to the gods. Another life kept. Each dawn was a roll call. The fire was stirred, names were spoken, counts were made. Sometimes the silence after a name was longer than it should be. Someone would rise, pull back the furs, and find stillness that no warmth could undo. Death came quietly in those nights, leaving behind bodies that looked only asleep. The living carried them into the pale light and laid them beneath snow until the earth thawed. Then they returned, wordless, to their work. Yet the survivors did not meet in the morning with fear. They met it with reverence. The first blue light was holy. It touched walls blackened by smoke. It glinted in frost on the beams. It turned the air from grey to gold. The Vikings called this time Dagmal, the measure of day. To step into it barefoot was to feel the world being born again. They believed dawn had a spirit of its own. Dellinger, the bringer of light. Songs were once sung to him before chores began. Not hymns, but quiet greetings. Welcome back, gentle one. We still live. Even the animals joined in. Dogs stretching, cows groaning, crows breaking the silence with that first coarse cry that sounded like laughter. After so many hours of darkness, colour itself felt foreign. The snow turned from black to blue, the sky from iron to silver. People blinked hard, eyes watering from brightness. Children laughed and stumbled outside, their feet sinking into glittering drifts. Even the air smelled different. Less of smoke, more of ice and clean wind. But morning also meant reckoning. Fires had to be rebuilt, tools thawed, water fetched from holes in the ice. The Vikings greeted the new day with work. Their gratitude was practical. The first sound after dawn was the clang of iron, someone splitting wood or striking flint. The world moved again. They ate what was left from the night. Dried fish, cold broth, bits of bread gone stiff with frost. Each bite was a reminder that life persisted not through abundance, but through persistence itself. Survival was not a moment of triumph, but a rhythm. Breathe, eat, move, endure. Even after light returned, the memory of darkness clung to them. They carried it in their bones. People spoke more softly in the mornings, as if afraid to scare the sun away. Children were told not to cry before daylight fully filled the room. The night still listens, mothers would say, touching their cheeks. There were rituals for dawn. In some places, the first act was to open the door wide and let the cold rush in, a gesture of respect for the world outside, acknowledging that even in its cruelty, it had spared them. In others, families threw a pinch of salt or ash into the wind, offering thanks to whatever unseen hand had turned the earth back toward light. Some mornings were harder, the firewood piles too low, the breath too thin, the grief too fresh. On those days, dawn was not comfort, but reminder that survival demanded another day of effort, that the night would return soon enough. Yet even then, they stepped into the cold, because to hide from the light was to dishonour the dead who would never see it again. When the first sunlight finally struck the snow, it scattered into brilliance, shards of gold on a white world. Faces lifted toward it instinctively. Even the oldest, who had seen 100 such mornings, still murmured small prayers under their breath. Light on skin felt like forgiveness. It said, "You were not meant to go yet." And with that light came sound, birds, wind, the low hum of thawing water. After months of stillness, it was overwhelming. Some villagers wept openly, not from sadness, but from the relief of hearing the world again. The silence had been so heavy, so absolute, that the noise itself felt sacred. The day that followed was fragile. The sun lingered low, its warmth barely touching the earth. Shadows stayed long, but no one complained. They worked, laughed, argued, loved, all under the same pale fire that might vanish again at any moment. By midday, the scent of smoke mixed with melting snow filled the air. The world smelled alive again. The Vikings believed this was when the gods walked unseen among them, curious to see who had endured their trial. So they behaved with quiet pride, offering their resilience as proof of worthiness. When evening came, the sky glowed faintly pink before sliding back toward grey. People prepared the fire again, laid furs in their places, whispered to the gods as they had the night before. But the mood was different. They had seen the light, they knew it would return. And as darkness reclaimed the horizon, no one cursed it. They accepted it like an old guest. The night was not the enemy anymore. It was part of the same cycle that made the morning precious. For the Vikings, dawn was never ordinary. It was resurrection, small and daily. Each sunrise said what no saga could put into words: you survived, you are still part of the story. When the first true morning finally arrived after a long storm, it came like a secret being revealed. No trumpet of light, no blazing dawn, just a pale wash of silver through the cracks in the roof, so faint you could mistake it for memory. The Vikings moved quietly in that first light, as if afraid it might vanish if they moved too quickly. There were no cheers, no loud prayers, only the small sounds of gratitude, the rustle of furs, the creak of knees as people knelt to feed the fire one more time. Someone would open the door and the cold would rush in, sharp, clean, merciless, carrying the scent of snow and pine and smoke. It bit at the skin like a blessing that stung. Outside, the world was almost too bright to look at. The snow reflected the weak sun in 1,000 directions, turning everything into light. Even the shadows gleamed. You could see your breath glowing in front of you like a thread of silver pulled through air. And for a moment, you understood why their ancestors had worshipped the dawn. Not as a time of day, but as an act of mercy. In those hours, the village looked like it had been reborn. The roofs glistened with frost, and the smoke from every chimney curled upward as though racing toward the gods. The sound of axes began, the steady heartbeat of work returning. It meant life, movement, control over something again. Children were often the first to laugh. They'd stumble outside barefoot, squealing at the bite of the snow, their mothers calling them back with scolding smiles. The laughter carried through the village like a bell. People stopped what they were doing just to listen to it. That sound was proof that the world had not ended. After the morning count, the fire was stirred and the dead were named. Not mourned, named. To speak their names was to carry them forward. The Vikings didn't wall off death, they folded it into life. Every new dawn was built on the silence of those who didn't wake. Some mornings, when grief hung heavy, the villagers would gather by the shore and face the rising sun together. They didn't pray aloud. They stood in silence, each thinking of someone lost, and waited for the light to climb the horizon. When it did, they turned back to their homes without a word. The ritual didn't need language. It was acknowledgement enough that the living still had work to do. Those who lived through the winter carried a strange glow in their faces, as though the light had to pass through their bones before it could reach the air. There's an old Icelandic saying, "The sun is a memory, not a promise." They knew it might vanish again, but that didn't stop them from lifting their faces to it. Faith wasn't about expecting warmth. It was about daring to believe it would come back. Inside the homes, that same light painted everything in gold and grey. It reached across fur blankets, across sleeping faces, across walls blackened by smoke. For a moment, the whole house looked alive again. Someone would hum an old song, not about victory or strength, but about gratitude. The melody had no words, only a rise and fall like breathing. And for that single day, the world seemed at peace with itself. No one spoke of the cold that would return, or the next storm waiting beyond the horizon. It didn't matter. They had seen the light again. Because after a night that long, even the smallest sunrise felt like resurrection. And the act of waking, that simple, miraculous act, was the loudest prayer they ever spoke. how the Vikings' struggle with darkness revealed a truth we have forgotten. Maybe they slept better because they feared more honestly than we do. For them, every night was a rehearsal for death, a quiet surrender, letting go. The Vikings didn't hide from darkness. They built their lives inside it, made peace with it, and listened to what it said. They knew something that modern light has made us forget, that rest is not safety, but faith. They believed that to sleep was to trust the world one more time, to trust that the fire would hold, that the gods would not turn away, that the dawn would return. Every breath that passed between dusk and morning was a kind of prayer, not with words but with survival. Today we drown that silence. We light every room, fill every pause, banish every shadow. Yet the Vikings knew that darkness was not the enemy. It was the teacher. It stripped away everything unimportant. It showed what truly kept a person alive: warmth, kinship, belief and courage. When they closed their eyes, they faced the same fears we still carry: the unknown, the loneliness, the quiet voice that asks what comes next. But they did not turn away from it. They faced it with open eyes until sleep took them. And when they dreamed, they believed their ancestors watched over them, not from heaven or some unreachable place, but from just beyond the firelight. The sagas say that when a Viking died, the gods decided where his soul would go: to Valhalla, to Hell, to Freya's fields. But for the living, the difference mattered less than what the dead still represented. They were proof that endurance was possible. Every grave mound was a reminder: someone before you faced the same night and woke again. Archaeologists find their bones now, curled in furs, surrounded by tools, weapons and bits of food for the journey. Those offerings were not superstition. They had faith in continuity, a belief that even death was just another kind of sleep, and that the dead, like the living, needed warmth and light to guide them. In that belief there was no despair, there was acceptance. The Vikings didn't imagine immortality as escape, but as participation, to become part of the cycle, the soil, the wind, the flame. Death wasn't the end of their story. It was simply the moment they stopped fighting the dark and became part of it. If they could speak to us now, maybe they'd tell us that the secret of their sleep wasn't how deeply they rested, but how completely they trusted the night. They didn't need quiet rooms or soft beds or empty minds. They needed only the sound of breath, the pulse of fire, and the knowledge that morning might come. And that if it didn't, the fire would still burn somewhere for someone else. There is something in that faith that modern people have lost. We chase comfort, but not connection. We demand control, but not surrender. We think light saves us, when sometimes it only blinds us to the beauty of what darkness gives: reflection, stillness, and awe. The Vikings carried their wisdom in silence. They didn't write philosophies. They built them, in wood, in ritual, in the way they lay down beside one another, shoulder to shoulder, trusting that life could continue through warmth alone. They were not free from fear. They were simply honest about it. Every winter, as the world froze around them, they learned the same lesson again: that life is not guaranteed, but it is sacred; that warmth means nothing if not shared; that courage is not roaring fire, but a steady ember that refuses to die. When the first sunlight of spring finally came, they did not celebrate with shouts or feasts. They stepped outside in silence, lifted their faces to the light, and smiled. The world had survived, and so had they. It is easy to romanticize them: the warriors, the explorers, the poets of cold and storm. But their greatest strength wasn't in their swords or ships. It was in their nights, in their ability to face the void, to find meaning inside it, to sleep beside death and still dream of life. Because in the end, that was the core of their faith: that even the darkest night is still part of the same sky as the dawn, that the same fire that burns can also warm, that the same silence that terrifies can also heal. The dead still teach us this if we listen. The lesson is not buried with them. It moves in the air, hums beneath the frost, glows in every spark that survives till morning. It tells us that endurance is its own kind of peace. That rest is not escape, but gratitude. That fear is the proof of life, and that the secret to sleeping well, the way they did beneath endless night and freezing sky, is not comfort but courage. Because they did not sleep to forget the world, they slept to remember it. Archaeologists still uncover their resting places. Bones wrapped in furs surrounded by the humble objects of survival. Combs, bowls, stones blackened by fire. Each artifact feels like a whisper left for the future. A message that says, this was what mattered when everything else was gone. Some graves have burned wood mixed with the soil, traces of old hearths. It's as if they wanted to take their home with them. The warmth that had shaped their nights, the smoke that had carried their stories. In a few, the ashes of the family fire were placed beneath the head of the dead, so that even in the earth they would sleep close to light. The Vikings never imagined eternity as distance. Heaven wasn't far away, it was right beside them, separated only by the thin veil of frost and breath. That's why they built burial mounds within sight of their doors, so that when they looked out each morning, they could still see their ancestors keeping watch over the living. Every mound was a memory made physical, a reminder that death was not disappearance. The dead continued to protect the land, to guard the hearth, to whisper courage into dreams. To forget them was to lose the fire twice, once in the body and once in the heart. In the sagas, warriors often said they did not fear death because they had already met it in winter. The endless nights, the hunger, the silence, those were rehearsals for the final crossing. To survive the north was to learn how to die without despair, and to the Vikings, dying well meant leaving behind more than bones. It meant leaving warmth in the memory of others. Modern people build monuments of stone and steel, but the Vikings built them of story. Each name spoken beside the fire was another kind of immortality. Every retelling of a dream, a battle, or a kindness was a resurrection. They knew that what endures is not the body, but the echo it leaves in those who remember. Their wisdom wasn't about glory, it was about continuity. Life, death, and sleep all folded into one another, each feeding the next. When the old fell silent, the young took their place by the fire, using the same words, telling the same tales, stirring the same embers. The chain was unbroken. The light moved forward. There's a strange peace in that kind of simplicity. It strips away the noise of modern immortality, the obsession with legacy, achievement, permanence. The Vikings understood something quieter, that to be remembered kindly, even briefly, is enough. To have been a source of warmth for someone else, that is eternity in its smallest, truest form. Somewhere in the north, the wind still moves through the grass that grows over their graves. It sounds like breathing. It sounds like sleep. The earth remembers every life it ever carried, every fire that ever burned upon it. And in that remembrance, the Vikings still live. Not in temples or in heaven, but in the hum of the land itself. They would want us to understand that the line between life and death is thin because it has to be. Without that thinness, the world would lose its meaning. The cold would have no warmth to measure itself against. The night would have no dawn, and so when we think of them, these people who slept with fear as their blanket and courage as their fire, we are not looking backward. We are looking into a mirror made of the time. Their struggle, their peace, their faith, all of it is still inside us. Because what the dead still teach us is simple, that survival is a kind of prayer, that every breath in the dark is sacred, and that the warmth you pass on is the only thing death can never take. The quiet triumph of waking and the ember that still burns within us. The world is still dark when you open your eyes. The fire is nothing but a pulse beneath ash, a dim red heartbeat, breathing slow, patient, ancient. You listen. No wind, no movement, just the steady silence of survival. Somewhere in that stillness you realise you have seen another morning. That was everything the Vikings ever wanted. To wake, to see the faint blue at the horizon, to know they had endured one more night in a land that tried every day to erase them. Someone stirs beside you. A breath, a quiet cough, a whisper of life. The frost on the roof beam softens, melting into drops that fall and hiss as they touch the coals. Outside, the light begins to return, thin as smoke. You rise, pull the cloak tighter around your shoulders, and kneel beside the hearth. The ashes shift under your hand, soft and cold. But there it is, heat, faint and stubborn. You feed it straw, breath, a fragment of wood, and for a moment, nothing happens. Then, a flicker. A single golden tongue of flame licking the air. The fire lives again. That act, that simple revival, was everything to them. It meant the night had not won. It meant the gods had not turned away. In that moment of light returning, they saw proof of everything their world believed, that even in the most endless dark, something always waits to be rekindled. They did this every morning, every winter, for centuries. The same motion, the same breath, the same whisper to the fire. The past never truly vanished in the north. It repeated itself like heartbeat and flame, always beginning again. The Vikings knew that life was a fragile rhythm, one that could stop at any moment, and so they built their courage in small acts, feeding a fire, mending a cloak, keeping watch for another's breath. Those gestures mattered more than prayer, more than power. They were proof of care, and care in the cold was the only kind of love that survived. Now imagine them stepping outside. The snow crunches, the sky glows faintly pink. The first light spills over the sea ice like spilled mead, gold spreading over silver. It touches their faces, and they close their eyes against its brightness, smiling without knowing why. That feeling, that quiet awe at having lived through the night, is something we've lost. We wake to alarms, not to gratitude. We rush, we scroll, we light the world until no darkness is left. But the Vikings would tell us darkness was never the enemy. It was the thing that made light sacred. They would tell us that the secret of endurance isn't strength, but rhythm. The steady rising and falling, the endless cycle of surrender and renewal. They trusted that rhythm. They didn't need certainty. They only needed faith that morning would find them again. Maybe that's what the ember means now. Not just survival, but remembrance. It's the echo of every soul that ever tended a flame in the night. Every life that refused to vanish quietly. It burns in us too, even when we forget it's there. The fire you see when you close your eyes, that warm pulse behind the lids, is older than you. It's the same light that kept the north alive, the same light that flickered in longhouses, that guarded warriors, mothers and children through centuries of cold. It never went out, it just changed shape. The Vikings are gone, their fires long turned to ash, but every time we strike a spark, every time we light a candle, every time we stare into the glow of something that pushes back the dark, we repeat their ritual. We remember them. We continue them. So let the light touch your face. Feel the warmth crawl into your hands. Listen to the soft breathing of the world waking beside you. You have survived another night, your own small Thimble Vita, your own winter of silence and uncertainty. And if there's a lesson in all of it, in their courage, in their fear, in their sleep, it's this. The night is long, but it ends. The cold is cruel, but it teaches. And the fire, if you guard it, never truly dies. So sit for a moment longer by the glow. Breathe. Watch the light gather strength. Because this quiet, this warmth, this small miracle of survival is the closest any of us will ever come to understanding how the Vikings dreamed, how they endured, and how they learned to rest even when the world around them never did. Before you leave the hearth, you look once more at the fire. It's smaller now, just a circle of orange veins weaving through grey. You can hear the quiet hum of the world waking again outside. A crow, a creak, the first sound of thawing. You reach into the ashes and feel their warmth. It's a different kind of heat now. Not fierce, not wild. It's the warmth that stays, the warmth that remembers. It clings to your skin like something alive, reluctant to let go. You realise that every ember in history felt the same glow that burned in longhouses, the same light that touched the faces of those who came before you. You are holding the pulse of centuries. The Vikings would have understood that feeling. To them, the act of tending a flame was never small. It was a way of joining the oldest rhythm on earth: creation, destruction, renewal. The same rhythm that turns night to dawn, frost to water, silence to song. Each breath you draw beside the fire becomes part of that rhythm, as if the world is exhaling through you. For a moment you imagine those who watched before you, the mothers whispering lullabies to restless children, the watchers who faced the dark with trembling hands, the warriors who dreamed beside their last fire before battle. They are all here, inside this light, not ghosts, but memory given shape. You feed the last piece of wood into the coals and watch it catch. The flames rise, slow and graceful, like something remembering how to dance. The light spills across the walls, and for an instant, the house seems full again, full of breath, laughter, voices. The past and present overlap until they are one. This was their secret, and maybe it's ours too, that life is not measured in years or victories, but in how faithfully we tend what's fragile. A spark, a soul, a story. That the fire you keep alive becomes the light someone else finds in their own night. Outside, the sky is clear now, washed clean, pale, infinite. You open the door and the cold rushes in, sharp as truth, pure as prayer. The smoke follows you out, winding upward into that new morning. You watch it drift higher and think, this is what it means to last. Because even if the world forgets your name, the fire remembers your hands. And as long as something still burns, anywhere, in anyone, the night will never truly win. What survived the long night still lives inside us. The snow is gone now, but the cold never really left the world. It lingers in our houses, in our bones, in the quiet between thoughts. The age of longhouses and hearths has ended, yet somehow we are still the same creatures. Huddling close to small lights, frightened of silence, longing for warmth. Look around. The fires are different now. They burn in glass boxes, in blue screens, in electric suns that never dim. We keep them alive with our thumbs instead of kindling. We stare into them for hours, searching for meaning, reflection, companionship. We are still keeping watch, still waiting for the night to end. And perhaps that is the proof that the old rhythm never died. We have replaced embers with pixels, but the need is identical. To see something glow in the dark and know that we are not alone. Modern people like to think they've conquered the night. Cities shine so bright that stars have forgotten where we are. But when the noise fades, when the world finally goes still at 2 a.m, you can feel that same ancient weight pressing against the walls. The quiet intelligence of darkness, asking what you really fear. It's no different from the silence that once haunted the fjords. We still whisper to ourselves before sleeping. We still listen for sounds that aren't there. We still dream of our dead. Inside every apartment window, behind every curtain, some version of the old Viking vigil continues. A person sitting awake, guarding their own small flame. It might be a phone screen or a bedside lamp, but the instinct is identical. We tend to do it, not because we need light, but because we need something to believe in when the rest of the world fades. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them. The watchers, the mothers, the warriors, breathing with you. Their world was simpler, but their fears were not smaller. They too wondered if morning would come. They too stared into a restless light and saw their reflection trembling there. We think progress has made us fearless, but maybe the Vikings were braver because they faced their darkness without distraction. They sat inside it. They listened until they understood it. They didn't try to erase it with light. They made peace with it. There's a lesson in that for us now. We hide from the quiet. We treat stillness like a threat. Yet the Vikings knew that the mind needs silence as much as the body needs sleep. Without it, the soul forgets how to rest. Somewhere in the oldest part of our memory, that understanding still lives. It's what draws us to campfires, candles, sunsets, the things that move slowly, burn patiently. and ask nothing except that we stay a while. If the people of the North could stand among us now, they would not recognise our tools, but they would recognise our faces. They would see the same fatigue, the same searching eyes. They would understand our sleeplessness. They would tell us to turn off the noise and listen again to the quiet pulse beneath it, to remember that peace is not given, but built. Because that was always their secret. Peace was a craft. You shaped it the same way you shaped a ship, piece by piece, day by day, until it could carry you through whatever storm came next. Imagine one of those old watchers standing in our world. He would see our endless lights and shake his head, wondering how we could be surrounded by fire and still feel so cold. He'd step into the night outside the city and look up, waiting for stars that barely exist here. He would smile when he found even one. That small point of brightness would be enough. It always was. Maybe he'd tell us, "You've mistaken comfort for safety." The night was never your enemy. It was your teacher, because the dark still has things to teach us. It reminds us how fragile light is, how sacred every spark becomes when the world turns cold. We no longer burn wood to survive, but we burn hours, thoughts, pieces of ourselves. We call it productivity. The Vikings would call it sacrifice. They would tell us that every fire needs boundaries, that to let it rage too long is to lose yourself inside it. So what can we learn from them now, at the end of this long remembering? That faith does not live in temples, but in rituals. That survival is made of small, repetitive mercies, tending warmth, sharing breath, forgiving the night for being long. That even when gods go silent, the act of keeping a flame alive is its own kind of prayer. You can still practice it. Tonight, when the noise settles and the lights finally dim, light one small candle. Sit with it. Watch how the flame trembles, how it breathes in rhythm with you. Listen to the quiet behind it. That's the same silence the Vikings listened to, the same darkness they trusted to return them to morning. Maybe you'll feel something move in that quiet, a presence that isn't frightening at all, just old and patient. Maybe it's the echo of every watcher who ever stayed awake, making sure the world didn't slip away while others slept. You don't need to call it faith. You don't need to name it. Just let it remind you that the fire still burns. Not out there in some forgotten hall, but here, in you. The ember the Vikings carried through blizzards and centuries has become your pulse, your persistence, your courage to face another day. It's what drives you to rise after grief, to seek light after loss, to begin again when you thought there was nothing left. That's the same fire, the same story retold in flesh and time. Every breath you take in darkness adds one more verse to that saga. Every act of kindness is another spark passed forward. Every quiet moment of reflection is another ember refusing to die. So when the night feels endless, when silence presses close and the world seems too heavy, remember this. The people of the North once lived through winters that swallowed the sun. They built their faith not in daylight, but in endurance. And they left behind not monuments, but a method. Tend the flame. Trust the dark. Wait for dawn. That was all they ever did, and somehow it was enough to light the world. Now it's your turn. Go to the window. Look out into whatever night you have. Somewhere, miles away, someone else is awake beside their own small fire. Another watcher, another descendant of the long winter. Between you stretches the same darkness the Vikings once knew, but it no longer frightens you. You understand it now. It's the same darkness that makes the stars visible. You whisper, maybe aloud, maybe only in your heart. The fire still burns. And it does, it always will. If this story kept your fire alive, keep it burning. Subscribe to Viking Times for more journeys into the cold, the courage, and the forgotten wisdom of the North. Tell me in the comments, which city's night are you watching from? Until next time, rest well, traveller of the North.